Now let's put supply and demand together, and we're going to talk about how supply and demand can show um, how a market achieves allocative efficiency. Remember, allocative efficiency is producing what people want. Now there's one rule I want you to remember. When you look at supply and demand, always first focus on price and know that there are always two quantities associated with price. There's a quantity supplied, and a quantity demanded. No exceptions. And there's a special price where the quantity supplied and quantity demanded happen to be equal, but there are still two quantities for every one price, and that's the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is a special price. That's the price where if the price reaches equilibrium price, we achieve allocative efficiency because people are producing what people want. Supply equals demand. Let's look at that. Now, please understand that when you achieve allocative efficiency, the efficient outcome is not necessarily the happy outcome. In other words, people may not be happy with allocatively efficient outcomes. I can make the case that the market rent for housing in San Francisco for a one-bedroom apartment is $4,000 a month. Now, you may feel that's outrageous, but I can say, hey, supply equals demand, and that's allocatively efficient. So efficiency does not always equate to happiness. So that's another reason why some people have problems with the free market system, is because it cares about things that may not be on the top priority of others. Now let's look at this. Here we have prices. And we could look at different prices, and remember, for every one price, there are always two quantities associated with it, quantity supplied and quantity demanded. So let's look at a price 50. Here are the two quantities. There's a quantity supplied, 148, and a quantity demanded at that one price. In other words, suppliers are willing and able to supply 148 units at $50, but people are only willing and able to demand 5 units. So if you produce 148, but people demand only 5, you're going to have a surplus. Now, a surplus is a representation of allocative inefficiency. You're not producing what people want. You're producing too much. Well, this is going to, because you have inventory, this is going to put a downward pressure on price. Well, if we lower it to 45, can you see how the law of supply, let me draw this here. Let me erase this. And remember the law of supply. Law of supply. Price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So you see how price is going down here, and look what's happening in quantity supplied. It's also going down. Supply falling in the case of a surplus helps reduce that surplus. Now, what about demand? Law of demand. When price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And you can see when price goes from 50 to 45, look at demand. It goes from 5 to 8. So it's going up. That also helps fix the surplus. When people demand more, the fact that you have too much helps reduce that surplus. But even at 45, you still have a surplus. It's just smaller. As long as there's a surplus, there's going to be downward pressure on price. And as price falls, supply continues to drop and demand continues to increase until we get to price 20. And in this case, we have demand of 39, supply of 39, and demand of 39. And that means we've achieved allocative efficiency. We're producing what people want. Now we can look at this from an opposite point of view. Let me erase this. Now let's start at price 10. At price 10, quantity supplied is only 10, but quantity demanded is a whopping 57. So here we have a shortage. Now, this is not allocatively efficient either. You're not producing what people want. You're producing too few. And so law of demand, this is going to put upward pressure on price as price goes up. Let's look at law of supply first. Law of supply. Quantity supplied goes up. See, when price goes up from 10 to 15, look what's happening to supply. It's going up. That helps fix the shortage. You're supplying more when you don't have enough, right? What about the law of demand? When price goes up, look what happens to quantity demanded. It goes down. And that helps fix the shortage. And again, there's movement towards the equilibrium price, where supply equals demand. Now, graphically, it's going to look like this. Here's your supply demand curve, and here's your supply curve. Now, at price 20, the two curves cross, and that's going to mean that's where supply equals demand. Now, remember, for any one price, you're going to have two quantities. For example, at price 50, the two quantities are here and here. At price 40, the two quantities are here and here. Do you see how every price has two quantities? Well, what about this price? They're both at the same location. So supply equals demand. Now, when price is above equilibrium, you have a surplus. In other words, any price above 20, you're going to have a surplus. At any price below 20, you're going to have a shortage. So in other words, any price other than 20, you have allocative inefficiency. Now, what I didn't understand when I took economics is I didn't understand how a shortage or surplus would open up in the first place. Let's go back to this picture right here. What I don't understand is if you're at price 20, why would anybody charge a price above 20 knowing that you're going to have a surplus, right? And why would you charge a price below 20 knowing that you're going to run out of goods and services and you're going to give your rivals an opportunity by running out of product? So in other words, I didn't understand how a shortage or surplus can open up. The reason why is because my textbook and your textbook is not animated. What do I mean by animated? Well, guess what? Curves, supply curves and demand curves shift all of the time. And shifts can happen instantaneously. But our reaction to that shift takes time. Now, how do we react? Well, we can react by offering different prices. So prices adjust after curves shift. And that's how a shortage or surplus opens up. Let me show you that. I have a nice step-by-step process that shows you this. Where is it? Come on. It's right here. Come on. This is the right here. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. I'm just going to move this down a little bit here. Okay, there. Okay, so let's start at equilibrium. Price is equilibrium price, and notice how at that price, quantity supplied, and let me just move this down a little bit more. Quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. Now, what if, let's say, consumers get more income, and this is a normal good, so they demand more. That's going to shift the demand curve. Now, keep your eye on demand here. When I shift the demand curve to the right, look what happens. Notice how demand is changing, but quantity supplied hasn't changed because price hasn't changed and the supply curve hasn't changed. And so this new demand curve leads to a new demand and the old supply. Now watch this. The old demand curve is no longer relevant. Watch what happens when I get rid of it. Do you see how that's how a shortage opened up? Your demand is now greater than supply. And because you have a shortage, this is going to put upward pressure on prices. Now watch what happens when price starts to go up. It affects both supply and demand. Watch this. And now we have a new equilibrium. But do you see how the shortage opened up? It started with a shift, and prices did not have enough time to adjust, and that caused a shortage. And then the shortage led to higher prices, and supply and demand adjusted to the new equilibrium. Let me give you another look at this. But this time, I'm going to track demand with my pen. So demand currently is starting right here. Now, when I shift the curve, demand has moved to here. Now, when prices start to increase, demand moves again back to here. So notice demand has made this U-turn here and back. And it hasn't gotten back to its new price, old quantity right here. The reason why it made a U-turn is the first initial change was due to a shift without a changing price. And then prices started to go up and it took back some of that increase in demand. Now supply, let's look at supply. Supply starts off right here, and then when the demand curve shifts, supply has not changed. But look what happens when we do start changing price. It does affect supply, and now supply moves this way. So you can see how I've broken down the step-by-step process here. And this is how a shortage or surplus opens up. Now, the faster we move to a new equilibrium, the greater the reduction in allocative inefficiency. In other words, if we have a shortage or surplus that stays that way for a long period of time, that means we have more allocative inefficiency. So this is important that we react quickly to this and we minimize the waste due to producing either too much or too few in terms of what people want.